Thanks a lot. First of all, I would like to thank the Academy here to do this great event, which is really has been a highlight for me this year. It has been really in-depth analysis of what is happening in the markets. And with all the details here, I would like to contribute on my side on the implementation issues. I would also like to thank Gerd Volkers and Ernst Hafen to invite me to this special event, which is a great honor for me. So what I'm going to talk about, when I met Gerd 2 months ago, we were discussing a bit, what is this all about and what could I contribute. And I said, it's important to get the picture through that, what is the insurance industry doing with this genetic information, of course, that is just coming more and more to the markets. And that's one aspect. The other aspect is personalized medicine, and we have heard that personalized medicine is not just about genetics, it's about the environmental factors that are contributing to disease as well. We're going to talk about both of them. But also the insurance industry is not just looking at these risk factors, but we are also restricted in what we can do on a legal ground. So I'll be looking into that one in the final part of my presentation. So I've put together a short agenda for you. And actually in the first part of my presentation, I'll just highlight my learnings of the last 2 days and give you some thoughts about what is the conclusion I take from that. And then I'll talk a bit about the gene-environment interactions and then go on into how actually this information that is coming to the market is penetrating the insurance sector. So let's get started on my view on what you have been seeing over the last 2 days. I think you can relax now. You have seen all the presentations, you know it all. So what I'm going to show you here is just give you a flavor of what is my understanding of what is happening out there. And here, clearly you have seen over the last 30 years an explosion that is happening, a true revolution in terms of information that is being developed and is being made publicly accessible to everyone on genetic information. And it started in 1983 actually with the first identification of Huntington disease, which is a genetic disease and quite devastating late onset disease. And with a positive test result, you basically are told you will get the disease and you will actually die early of that disease. A devastating disease indeed. And that happened at the time when actually HIV came to the market, and all of a sudden HIV pandemic started up. And the whole discussion about the industry on how to deal with this information was raised. Because HIV was a dreadful disease at the time, and actually today, 30 years later, we can offer insurance again because they're treatable. So from a non-treatable disease, they became treatable, and we can now offer private insurance solutions again. And at the very same time, this Huntington disease gene came up to the market, and it was just in this fuel of debate that everything was starting about discrimination and having access to insurance as being such a fundamental issue. Now, it developed further. We have got PCR technologies. We had a number of different technologies coming to the market that really increased significantly the information flow of genetics. We had a number of high penetrant disease genes identified over the first 20 years. Particularly the Human Genome Project pushed it further advanced the whole situation. And in 2003, when it was really finished, a whole lot of more information was made available to all the geneticists out there who could do finally their research they always dreamt of. And I'm going to talk a bit about that. But that was not the only revolution happening out there. 2003 or 2000 actually, when the first genome was published on the internet, that was a revolution for science. All of a sudden, you had that information on your desk, in your computer. You were able to access it. Everybody around the globe was able to access that information. That was so crucial and important for advancing the thoughts about genetics and how they contribute to disease. But then this revolution continued, and the platforms actually started to merge. Now all of a sudden you had different platforms coming all together into one tool where you can today go into and for example, OMIM, which is a database that is collecting or identifying the information about genes and their phenotypes. And currently we have 21,000 genes characterized to a certain degree, not to a high degree, but to a certain degree. But then also all the mutation databases came up, where today we have 4,000 disease genes that have mutations, and a collection of mutations that is available to and made publicly available to everyone. But then also we have clinical information that is coming to the market as well. So that helps the clinicians to deal with the information. But it's again publicly available. Everybody can go there, everybody can get in there and get the information they need to understand genetics. I'm going to talk about that a bit further. Another key thing that is happening, or technology that was coming to the market, was the microarray, high throughput technologies. We've talked about that. 23andMe is using that technology to genotype these days. But it really was the breakthrough in 2006, 2007, when the density became so important. All of a sudden you had on a single slide that is 10 centimeters long, you could print 1,000 different markers, 1 million different markers, sorry. So 1 million, all of a sudden we had the potential to do bigger studies with lesser equipment. And that fueled it quite enormously. As of 2007, all of a sudden we were able to do these genome-wide association studies because we had the statistical power behind it. We had the 1 million SNPs that were needed actually to do the statistics to identify all the underlying genetic genes that were associated with disease. Now, what you can see here is on the left side, you have actually genes that were identified early on, in the first 20 years maybe. And they are high penetrance, they were identified through family studies. And yes, they're true genetic diseases. And so they come with a significant risk associated with them. But then with the genome-wide association studies, we identified now something like 100,000 different associations, associated with 200 different diseases. And so that's, with traits actually, so 200, and with all that information out there, actually they're just contributing a small proportion to the risk. It's not high proportions of risks anymore, they're small proportions. And we don't really understand how the combination of these different risk factors, of genetic risk factors, are contributing together to a significantly increased risk. And that's all research that needs to be undertaken, and a lot is being done already out there. But it needs a lot more to really understand it. And then finally, another technology revolution was the sequencing one. Sanger sequencing was introduced in 1990, but then actually in 2006, a whole new revolution came to the market with new platforms, and George Church was talking about them. A price dump that really came to the market. And this is actually, when you look at this red line following the curve here, this is an exponential curve here. So this is already, in the first 20 years, it was quite interesting to see how exponential decrease of the price of actually getting the sequences done. But then in 2006, 2007, that dropped even further. And there's no technology out there that has improved so much and so dramatically over the last 5 years than sequencing and the price of sequencing. And with that, of course, we see in parallel the information that is going up that has become available again on the public. So searchable databases becoming more and more powerful, sequencing becoming less and less expensive, and with that we are in a world where we can actually realize this $1,000 genome sequencing, which was started and propagated 10 years ago, and today we're almost there. George Church is telling me that you can today have your genome sequenced for $5,000, and I also ask him, well, for the man on the street, how easy is it for him to get this sequence done? I said, like, you take $5,000, walk across the street to the company and have it sequenced. There's no other protocol around that. So accessibility to the public is tremendous. 23andMe is also adding that element to the market where you, as a as a customer, can actually buy that information without going through a doctor. And that's quite dramatic, and it's interesting to see also how the prices are going down. And it's not just about the SNP analysis that 23andMe is doing, but now sequencing, full genome sequencing becomes available and will enter clinical practice soon. But as I said, genetics is not all, and I think you heard that several times during the 2 last days. Gene-environment interactions are key to the understanding of disease output, of the phenotype at the end of the day. So your propensity to disease depends on 2 major factors, which is genotype and non-genetic environmental components. They together form your propensity to disease. Your phenotype will determine through these 2 components. And if you look at actually a spectrum of diseases, you have to understand where exactly, when you're looking at a prediction, where do you stand? Do you stand more on the left side, more on the genotype-dependent diseases, like Huntington diseases, which are quite deterministic, and the genetic test really adds value to that one? On the other side, we have lung cancer, where smoking is the key factor to develop lung cancer disease. And of course, there are also genes involved in lung cancer development, and they can be as detrimental as the smoking, but smoking is the main disease risk. So you need to understand where exactly you are within that spectrum of disease before you can really make a good prediction on what the outcome could look like. Now, I've put this together, and it's quite an interesting idea, and looking at holistically what is adding to the premature mortality. There are 2 main components. 30% is genetic, 40% is behavior, and the rest are other environmental components that you may or may not be able to influence. It's the social circumstances, healthcare, environmental exposures, and so on. But the behavior is 40%. That's what the claim of this study is. 40% is a lot of information that needs to be taken into account when we really want to do personalized medicine and do good prediction of risk. So genetics, still 30% is a lot of information that needs to be taken into account and evaluated. Let's concentrate a bit on the environmental component. Environmental components are complex, and so is genetics. If you look at the common complex diseases, not just the genetic diseases, the common complex diseases, such as breast cancer, Alzheimer's, diabetes. The genes, the high penetrant genes, have been identified early on. Later on, we identified the low penetrant genes that are also associated with this disease. But then also the environmental component. We start to understand what those contributions are. And if you look at them, it's always the same. It's like exercise, obesity, smoking, that have actually an impact on a number of different common complex diseases. So they're not just, smoking is not just lung cancer related, but it increases the risk of a number of different cancer types. So that needs to be understood when looking at the risk profiles of the individual as well. On the other side, for example, if you look at the breast cancer genes, BRCA1 and 2, they're not just associated with breast cancer, they can also cause ovarian cancer and other types of cancer. So they're increasing the risk of a number of different cancer types. So it's a huge, complex system with a number of different variables that need to be understood to do a perfect risk assessment. So let's look at cancer risk factors. So what would we want to have and look at to do a perfect prediction? You would look at the basic risk factors first: age, gender, family history. You would look at the clinical risk factors, the medical history, the family history, the infections, tumor markers are all clinical risk factors that are important to consider. Environmental exposures need to be considered as well. And modifiable risk factors are the behavioral ones that are adding so much to the diseases, such as smoking, exercise, diet, and stress. So there are a lot of influencing factors out there, and actually the patient on the street can do a lot to do something about these risk factors and reduce them. Now, let's consider these are the two key informations that we need: environmental risk factors, genetic information. And of course, this whole conference has also concentrated quite a bit on the genetic testing market. And so how does it penetrate into the insurance setup? I would like to give you a couple of ideas on how this penetrates. So you have seen this slide several times, and in every single time people have told you there are 2,400 disease genes that clinicians can go out and have genetic tests done in the US as well, globally basically. But nobody has really told you which one of them are clinically relevant. So if we go in actually, and that's the ACCA framework that has been introduced yesterday by Robert Green, that has been done that in the UK by the Genetic Testing Network. They've looked at these 2,400 disease genes and said, okay, which one of them, by going through this clinical evaluation, which one are relevant and which one do we want to pay for? Because it's a publicly financed system, so they are cost cautious. So they went in and said, okay, we analyzed them and we came to the conclusion it's 541 that we will allow for people to undergo genetic testing because we see clinical value in that. 500 of these 2,400. Now, if you come to the market and insurance, life insurance market, then you ask yourself, from these 500, which ones are relevant to us? We are looking at late onset diseases. Because the early onset diseases, they're not that interesting to us because they already have a clinical outcome. And when they come to get out insurance at the age of 30, 35 maybe, they already have a clinical pattern which we can underwrite, which you can take the medical information and go by that and rate them for that. But then there are those that are late onset disease genes that we don't know yet. They have no clinical phenotype. And those, taken into consideration, are from these 500 about 30. So 30 are relevant for the life insurance industry. So make the calculation. There are 21,000 genes out there, 2,400 testable, 500 relevant, and 30 relevant for the insurance industry. Okay? So these 30 have caused a lot of damage to the industry. And a lot of legislation has been based on these 30 genes that are high penetrant and late onset disease. We are looking at the clinical market. Why are we doing that? Because the insurance industry is not just going ahead and using information that is not validated. We only use information, medical information in the underwriting process that is validated and has found its place in clinical practice. And we also look at the clinical studies out there. We look at the case controls and everything and make sure that the underwriting is then adjusted to clinical knowledge that is out in the public. And if you look at the markets, of course, we are interested in what is the genetic testing market doing and how does it penetrate into the insurance sector, because we are afraid of people out there, of course, that take out more insurance without displaying actually their risk. So it's an anti-selection risk for us. So we have seen in Europe, and that has been quite an interesting study in 2002, that the market was growing by 20 to 30% per annum. And when we look at in the UK, where we actually have some market information about penetration to the insurance market, we see a parallel growth of information being displayed at the time of taking out the policy in terms of genetic information. It's also a 20% growth that we had seen. Now, we were fortunate that actually in the UK we have a genetic testing network who's reporting their numbers, and at the same time we are reporting our exposure in the insurance industry. So the GTN 2003, that's the numbers that have been done in 2003 on genetic tests. And then the ABI, that's the number of kind of the insurance tests that have been displayed to the insurance at time of underwriting. And if you can see, if you can look at that, you can make a simple calculation. It's about 4% of the genetic tests done in clinical practice that are then displayed at time of taking out insurance the year after. So 4%, and then we have this, actually some diseases are giving out more information than others. That depends a bit on on the understanding of the person on their own individual risk. Now, in the UK, we have a special market environment, and you need to understand that because otherwise you won't understand this outcome. So we had, actually in the UK, we have a moratorium that doesn't allow the life insurance industry to use genetic test information in the underwriting process, with two exceptions to it. One is the Huntington disease one, where we can use it, but only as of a very high sum insured, £400,000 and above. Which is a lot of insurance, and it's only about 0.5% of actually the market, insurance market, who would take out that much insurance. And then on the other side, we were able, and that's very specific to the UK market, to use the genetic test information if it's negative, to waive the family history information, because we would rate still people for family history backgrounds, which also carries some genetic information. And so they came to us actually, and out of the predictive genetic tests that were displayed to us, 75% were negative. So the consumer clearly understands how he can reduce price. And you will understand as well that the consumer will understand how to actually take out more insurance, as shown actually yesterday by Mr. Green as well. Of course they understand how they can financially safeguard themselves and take out more insurance when it's needed. But here, that's a perfect example. You see, you get a feeling for the exposure actually. It's 4% that penetrates, and you can then extrapolate and can say, okay, how much anti-selection you probably have in the market. It's still not a lot, but the numbers are growing, and therefore there is, of course, the fear that we lose this private insurance market through too much anti-selection that comes to the books. And what is the private insurance market? And I think I want to spend a little bit of what is insurance, private insurance, and how does it distinguish itself from the social insurance sector. Private insurance is really you as a customer have the choice to take out insurance. You take what you need. There's no obligation on you to take it out. And on the other side, we would like to make sure that we have the right to group together those with the same risk and give them the right premium and adjusted premium to their risk. And so a lot of confusion has come in the last years when the debate was coming in, that always this social insurance was mixed up with the private insurance sector. So that's why the debates are so different. So social insurance is the compulsory insurance. It offers, it's usually government-bound, tax-funded, for example, or sometimes the government just gives out guidelines like in Switzerland, where you have to take out the compulsory health insurance scheme. Then you have the group insurance scheme, which is in the middle, where the employer gives you medical insurance, and that is mainly in the US the main provider of health insurance. And the private insurance sector really tops up on top of the social and group insurance and kind of leverages and offers you your personalized need for additional insurance. So it's not compulsory, it's free. You take it out when you need it. Now, in that private insurance sector, it's important to understand that there is where market economics really play. We need to be offering an efficient insurance market because we're competitive. There are lots of insurers out there offering competitive prices, and you as a customer can go out and get the cheapest price out there. And if you do so, we want to understand what your risk is, because then we can lower the premiums. The better we are in risk assessment, the lower the premiums will be for the entire pool that we put together. So everybody is paying their own premium for their insurance they take out. So that's different from the pool insurance system that we have in the healthcare market, in most of the healthcare markets that are actually governmentally regulated. So here we have also kind of some statistics on acceptance rates, and we have always been claimed that, oh, you're going to discriminate everyone and not accept them insurance. 99% of life insurance policies are accepted at 90% at standard rate. 8% or 9% on top are additionally rated. And there is this 1% out there that we decline or defer. And I would like to say something about the decline and defer. It's an economic issue why we don't offer that insurance. We could offer to everyone insurance, but as of a certain price, we say it's better for you actually to take your money, put it in the bank, and wait for that to grow, rather than take out insurance, which will cost you more. So there's an economic value behind that, and that's important to realize when you look at these numbers. So what are the two key risks that we are carrying in the life insurance market? So first of all, I told you before, we're looking actually at an insurance pool that enters the market at age 25 and exits the market at roughly 65 when they go into pension. So for life, that's just life insurance here. And the two main blocks of mortality risks are cancer and cardiovascular. Cancer is the number one. And these are the concerns that we have. And if you look now at the data on improvements, let's see whether we can get that slide up. Can you switch the slide, please? So there's improvement that we have actually in the cardiovascular sector. And over the last 30 years, we have stroke and cardiovascular and other cardiovascular disease. Actually, heart disease was reduced by something like 50%. So we have become really better at treating these patients and reduced the overall risk. On the other side, cancer didn't improve at all. It's 2.7% over 30 years. That's not a lot. And there has been, of course, a lot of fluctuation in there in that portfolio. But nevertheless, the overall is quite devastating. So if you look at the information that we take into the underwriting process, it's not just about medical risk factors. I mean, these are some important factors, of course, but for the large proportion of risk that we take into account, it's actually the non-medical factors that are risk relevant. It's the financial one. Does it make sense for you to take out insurance? The behavioral ones, smoking, fitness status, and so on, are as key and important to the risk selection process. And if you go into the cancer risk, and that's an important one to understand, so this is our prime exposure. And if you look at the symptomatic state, yes, of course, if you had already cancer, we look at your medical records and the past history of cancer, we look at tumor markers to a certain degree and give you a rating for that. But then on the disease-free status, we have family history, smoker status, BMI. These are the risk factors out there that we can use. Now, in the last 30 years, of course, the genetic testing market and other biomarkers have come to the market, and sometimes we are just restricted to use this information, even though it's so vital to cancer and to understand the risk of cancer. So that is important for you also to understand. Now, yes, we are using genetic information, and where do we do it? In family history, of course. Family history, we have been using that for over 150 years in the insurance sector, and it has proven value to us. We have used that information to risk rate, and of course, the genetic test adds, in certain degrees, it adds more value, but in some, it doesn't. If you don't have a BRCA1 mutation and have still a family history of breast cancer, you're still at increased risk if it's not the mutation that runs in the family. So we use that information and to that degree. Now, as I said before, the 30 genes that are relevant to us, they've caused a lot of debate. And it all started with the HIV debate in the 1980s. In the 1990s, the genetics debate came on top of that. And so the insurance industry had already kind of this fear factor in there, oh, I could be excluded if I have a detrimental disease. And genetics were just fueling that, and the scientists were not, the scientists were actually also guilty on actually fueling that debate, because they were claiming that you will see in the next 10 years every single gene that is associated with disease, and you will make a good prediction of your outcome. And today, actually, we understand it a bit better, and we can distinguish that a bit better. But nevertheless, it has fueled the debate on discrimination, privacy, and entitlement in particular. And of course, there are strong lobby groups out there. There are the consumer groups, which are lobbying for the data protection one. There are the social insurance, which is health insurance, healthcare access, was key and was considered as a social must-have. And the employment one, as a discrimination one, you don't want to be discriminated based on genetic information. But all the laws that have been implemented has also caused some troubles, and not just for the private insurance market, but also for the medical doctors, who have now to take special caution on dealing with genetic information in the clinical practice. They can't just store the information like they do with the medical information. Scientists in biobanks, we always are approached by insurers and by scientists and saying, oh, we can't do the studies because you insurers kind of discriminate everyone. So that's a bit of a difficulty there. Gender directive has been one of the conclusions that we had there. And so that's really difficult to get through, because gender is the basic genetic distinguishing factor. And even though we had actually all the evidence, and you can't really see it, but this evidence shows you that in France, for example, females are living 6 years longer than males, and nevertheless the regulator has said you can't use that information in the insurance underwriting process anymore. The GINA, the GUMP and GINA have been introduced in the meanwhile, which don't allow us to use the genetic information, particularly the pre-symptomatic information in the insurance sector anymore. And it's a very complicated system, because you as a clinician need to understand what the test definitions are, you need to understand what social and private insurance sectors are, and they're all a bit overlapping. So very, very difficult to understand. Also, what is a genetic test? Nobody really knows. It depends on the market. Every market has a different definition, and so that is very difficult. It's highly regulated for the insurance sector, I can tell you, and very complicated for a global company to actually monitor everything that is going on in the markets. And we need to comply to every single law that is out there, and that is important that we do it correctly and strictly comply to it. And so with that, we have also some burden out there to monitor all the processes that come out to the market. Now, personalized medicine is really about molecular testing markets, and the molecular markers are key to the information. If we can't use that information and it becomes relevant to the clinical setup, then we have a problem. Just a summary here. And we are offering into the clinical setting 2,400 tests. 501 are clinical relevant. 30 of them are important to the life insurance market. Their clinical over-the-counter testing is growing, as you have seen over the last couple of days. There is some penetration into the insurance market, and we can only estimate what the anti-selection risk is. But it's 4% that are disclosed. Family history is key and will continue to be a mitigating factor against anti-selection of genetic testing. Then the use of genetic information is highly regulated. It's very difficult to understand it and to make a proper judgment on what is considered a genetic test. Now, finally, the private insurance market is a non-compulsory market. You take out your insurance that you would like to have, and we make sure that the risks that you bring to the pool will be adequately risk analyzed. And finally, we have the life insurance who wants to fairly risk assess and make sure that anti-selection is reduced so that we can offer the lowest premium to the market. And finally, I just want one word to say: we are not asking for anyone to undergo genetic testing. With that, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this deep insight in the troubles and difficulties that you had, Christoph. We have time for 2 or 3 questions. Yes, Uta Franke.
So you're not requiring genetic testing, but are you asking people, applicants, whether they have undergone genetic testing? And if the answer is yes, are you asking for the information?
We can only ask in certain markets. Most of the markets actually don't allow us to even ask for the information. And if we are confronted with the information, because the patient gives us the information, in some markets, even if it is a negative test result, we can't even use that information, we just have to ignore it completely. So that is happening in most of the markets. Then there are some open markets, but again, it's highly regulated, and generally asking for the genetic testing information is not seen, because you approach a consumer and say, do you have a genetic test out there? That's not the first thing you would like to have in underwrite or in signing an insurance policy. So it's also publicly not accepted to ask for this information. So it regulates itself, basically.
So Christoph, thanks for this great talk. Two examples. You know, I have done my profile with 23andMe. Let's assume that the results have come back and I'm negative for APOE4E. Now, if I come to you and want to have a health insurance for, say, 300,000, below the barrier, 1,000 Swiss francs, I do not have to disclose this genetic information.
Yeah.
Does that mean, but if I say I'm negative and here is the proof for APOE4E, would that change my premium at this stage?
Actually, we're not allowed to use it in any case. So you have to take out 400,000 insurance before you're allowed to use the information.
No,
so that's the paradox.
The second question, if I do 400,000, then...
Yeah, it's a paradox because in the UK market, that's the only market that allows actually to take the negative test into account and weigh, for example, the family history rating that you may or may not have had. Maybe you have an Alzheimer's family history and then, yes, it's relevant. And then in that case, one could waive it. Now, in the Swiss market, no, you can't. You have to look at the information and say it doesn't exist, whatever there is. So, that's fair to both sides, of course, right? That's fair to those who carry the gene and those who don't carry, and they kind of equal them out in the pool.
Thanks.
Last question over here.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I was wondering, what is your prediction if you would say like the market is completely unregulated? What would happen to the insurance market? If you can use all the risks, in the end you can only charge as much as the customers would cost in the end, right? So you couldn't earn any money, or is that wrong?
Well, it's economics play into the market, right? Most of the insurers who take out a policy are standard rate and they don't present with any medical history or with little medical history that we rate. And so, as I said before, even if you would take out this genetic test information and would ask the customer to do so, it's first of all too expensive to finance it. And second, we are only interested in 30 genes which are late penetrants and frequently show up in the family history. So it doesn't really matter too much to us. And so we just follow what the clinicians are doing. If they start to do the tests out there, and then all of a sudden it's in the medical record, it will be presented to us at one point. And so there's a self-regulation going on, absolutely.
Thank you very much, Christoph. Thanks again.